Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And as this news starts to move into the mainstream, as it is already moving into the mainstream, there's lots of discussion about the implications. For those who have been following abrupt climate change in general, I think many of us already understand the implications. And maybe most people do. Maybe that's why climate change is a ratings killer. Nobody wants to be bummed out by the news of climate change, let alone take any real action around it. And it's an interesting thing. Quite a while ago, a few years ago, I read something just in passing, like on Facebook, and it was a study, and the study was something along the lines of if you talk about something that you want to do in the future a lot, you basically you give yourself this endorphin rush, and you make yourself feel like you're actually doing it without actually doing it. So basically the upshot of the study was stop talking about the things you want to do and just do them, because the more you talk about them, the more you kind of just make your mind think that you're already doing them. I don't know, there's lots of different theories about the way to manifest things in your life, or whatever that is, but whatever that might be for the individual. So it's interesting, though, surrounding climate change, the idea that, if you're talking about it, at least you're kind of in the mix of doing something about it, I guess, I don't know. It is one thing to talk about climate change. It is quite another to put yourself in the motion of mitigating climate change or taking action on it or whatever. Again, as climate change moves into the mainstream news, what to do about it. I mean, we've already talked and heard countless times what it is we need to do about it, and we just don't seem to be doing, obviously, as much as we need to fast enough. As Monsieur Hulot from France, the environmental minister, said, the mini steps aren't doing anything to mitigate climate change. They're just, it's a lot of talk. It's a lot of lip service. Hopefully somewhere, somehow, some way, not only can this news reach the mainstream, but maybe it can also provoke or inspire some real serious action, something outside of the clean energy piecemeal, everybody drive electric cars type of action, which we're not even really doing at the rate that we need to be doing it in order to really make a dent on fossil fuel emissions. We're really going to have to tighten the belt. And the belt will be tightened for us if we don't. So there you go. Do something or be forced to do it because of your inaction on doing it. Those are our choices. And guess what? I'm going to quickly read this. The most powerful storm of 2018 is headed toward Japan. This is from yesterday, but also current news today. The Atlantic hurricane season may be slipping by to little fanfare so far, but it's a different story in the Northwest Pacific. A dangerous super typhoon currently packing 170 mile per hour winds could make landfall in Japan early next week. Typhoon Jebby, which started getting organized east of Guam on August 27th, exploded to life over the last few days, intensifying from a Category 1 to a Category 5 equivalent storm in less than 48 hours. Between August 29th and 30th, Colorado State University tropical storm expert Philip Botzbach told Earther that based on its central pressure and maximum wind speeds, Jebby has achieved the dubious distinction of most powerful cyclone to date this year. Currently located 300 miles northwest of Saipan, Jebby is moving northwest at 60 miles per hour, continuing its trek over open ocean into the weekend before making an expected northward veer early next week. That turn will place it on a direct course for mainland Japan. Recent model runs show a high chance of the storm making landfall near Kyoto, potentially as a powerful typhoon. Jebby was in a fairly classic environment for rapid strengthening. Weather underground meteorologist Bob Henson told Earther via email, citing warm ocean waters and favorable upper-level wind conditions. Its forecast track is also a textbook case of recurvature, with initial movement toward the west or northwest. Henson added that because, Henson added that because Japan's islands run southwest to northeast, a small change in the track could have a big impact on exactly where Jebby makes landfall. I don't know if it's Jebby or Jebby, but I'm just saying Jebby. East of Shioku and south of Honshu, the storm could kick up waves up to 10 meters, 33 feet high as it approaches Japan, creating a hazard for ships, according to AccuWeather. The real concern is the impact on the heavily populated areas within the storm's forecast cone of uncertainty, including Tokyo. Flooding, mudslides, and destructive winds are all possible impacts. If this feels familiar, it's because we've been here before. Japan has already seen heavy rainfall associated with 2 typhoons, a tropical depression, and a tropical storm this month. AccuWeather notes, in July, western and central Japan experienced historic rainfall and deadly landslides, brought on in part with Typhoon Praparun and Typhoon Maria following closely on its heels, delivering even more rain to the nation's southern Ryukyu Islands. With northern hemisphere tropical cyclone activity often peaking in September and lasting through November, Japan may not be out of the woods for a while. Moving on to this news, a warm water time bomb could spell disaster for Arctic sea ice. The Arctic is in hot water, literally, following the discovery that heat has been accumulating rapidly in a salty layer of the Arctic Ocean 50 meters down. Currently, it's being held at that depth by a less dense layer of freshwater overhead, but if the 2 layers start to mix, it could melt all seasonal sea ice, accelerating the already rapid loss of polar ice cover. Researchers discovered the heat time bomb after analyzing publicly available data on ice cover and at different depths on sea temperature, heat content, and saltiness, or salinity, over the past 3 decades. The data was gathered around the Canadian Basin, a major basin of the Arctic Ocean fed by the waters from the North Chukchi Sea, just north of the Bering Strait between Alaska and Siberia. Over this time span, the heat content of the salty layer doubled from 200 to 400 million joules per square meter, enough to reduce overall Arctic ice thickness by 80 centimeters. The root cause is global warming, which has seen temperatures in the Arctic rise by 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels, twice the global average, leading to record low sea ice coverage. The researchers found that with sea ice retreating, heat absorption by exposed surface waters has increased 5-fold in 30 years, mainly from direct sunlight, which no longer gets reflected by ice. And with no ice in the way, strong northerly winds push these newly warmed surface waters at the Arctic fringes down to the depths where they're now accumulating under the Arctic. The fear is that the freshwater lid keeping them there could fall apart. It can be lost through increased mechanical mixing of the water layers, especially driven by the winds, says Mary Louise Timmermans at Yale University and head of the team. With continued sea ice losses, we'd have more wind-driven mixing, and that would erode this natural barrier. Loss of protective freshwater layer is already happening elsewhere around the Arctic and the Barents Sea north of Scandinavia, allowing warmer Atlantic waters to flow in and potentially destroy an entire Arctic ecosystem in the North Barents Sea within a decade. Yeah. The Arctic is just a mess, and I'm going to read this from Rolling Stone. It's not the entire article, which is every article in Rolling Stone is really, really long. So I would have to devote a whole show to reading this article, I think. But I'm going to get the at least the first bits of it, the crux of it. The melting Arctic ice is a real-time horror story. Why doesn't anyone care? I believe Robin sent this to me. Thank you, Robin. This is from Jeff Goodell, August 29th. Last week, scientists learned that 40-foot piles of compacted sea ice, some of the oldest and most durable clusters in the Arctic, are breaking away from the coast of Greenland and drifting out to sea. One meteorologist called it scary, but it was hardly unexpected. As the Earth's climate heats up, the idea of a blue Arctic, that is, the disappearance of sea ice for at least part of the year, leaving only open ocean, has long been predicted by climate scientists. Let me read that again. Long been predicted by climate scientists. Some researchers believe that you might be able to kayak to the North Pole as early as 2030. Others think the sea ice might last until 2040 or longer. The thawing of the Arctic is one of the biggest stories of our time, even if it is playing out at a pace and in a way that virtually guarantees most people will pay little or no attention to it. What's going on is not a future concern or simply a tragedy for polar bears. The warming Arctic is already having a tremendous impact on our world and may help explain much of the extreme weather this summer, especially in the US and in Western Europe. To oversimplify this only slightly, you could argue that this summer's historic wildfires in California were predicted by heat in the Arctic. In recent years, the Arctic has been heating up faster than any other place on the planet. Last winter, temperatures in the Arctic were 45 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. Last week, German climate scientist Stefan Rahmstorf wrote an excellent piece in Politico explaining why the warming Arctic is not only causing ice to melt, but changing the weather dynamics for the entire planet. Global warming leads to more heat extremes is not rocket science. It's not rocket science and has been confirmed by global data analysis, Rahmstorf wrote. He pointed out that we are seeing 5 times more monthly heat records, such as hottest July on record in California, than we would in a stable climate. More heat means drier soils, causing more drought and wildfires. It also means more extreme rain, given that a warmer atmosphere can suck up and then release more moisture. A global increase in rainfall records is well documented in weather station data. But then Rahmstorf made a crucial point. It's not just that I'm seeing things. It's not just that the weather is doing what it always does, except at a higher temperature level. Rather, there is growing evidence that the dynamics of weather itself are changing. The basic idea, Rahmstorf argued, is that the jet stream, a band of high winds around the northern hemisphere that significantly influences our weather in the mid-latitudes, is changing. Researchers showed in 2015 that the jet stream has actually slowed down significantly in recent decades and undulates more. The cause is likely to be the warming of the Arctic, as the stream is driven by the temperature contrast between the tropics and the Arctic. Because this temperature difference is getting smaller and smaller, the jet stream is weakening and becoming less stable. The weaker summer circulation means fewer weather changes, so the weather is becoming more persistent, Rahmstorf wrote. It's not only summer weather that is changing. Earlier this year, one study showed that when the Arctic is unusually warm, extreme winter weather is 2 to 4 times more likely in the eastern U.S. Extreme weather is 2 to 4 times more likely in the eastern U.S. As Rahmstorf noted, climate change does not just mean that everything is gradually getting warmer. A certain wave pattern in the jet stream, meandering from north to south, settles for a long time and brings heat and drought or continuous rain, depending on where you are in this pattern. Such a persistent jet stream pattern has played an important role in the weather extremes of recent weeks, connecting the extremes around the northern hemisphere. More extreme weather is not the only immediate and alarming consequence of the melting Arctic. Another is the thawing of permafrost, the vast realm of permanently until now frozen ground that lies beneath the snow and ice in the Arctic. I feel like sometimes these articles just say the same thing over and over and over, trapped in the but it's all pertinent information. If you haven't heard before, here it is. Trapped in this frozen soil and vegetation is more than twice the carbon found in the atmosphere. As the permafrost thaws, microbes come to life and start eating the buried organic matter, which in turn releases CO2 and methane, a greenhouse gas that is 25 times as potent as CO2, although shorter lived. The 2014 study estimated that thawing permafrost could release around 120 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere by 2100, which would contribute another 0.3. Now that whole sentence right there is the most laughable thing I've ever read. 120 gigatons of carbon by 2100 would contribute 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming. Okay. Bullshit. I call big old bullshit alert on that. And that may be a conservative estimate. All right, you guys. Last week, National Geographic ran a compelling story about Russian scientists who've seen permafrost melt in northern Siberia at a much faster rate than anyone anticipated. The landscape is warping and the ground is literally cratering as the soil thaws. And a new study by Katie Walter Anthony, a biochemist at the University of Alaska, has discovered that methane is bubbling out of the thermokarst lakes, meltwater lakes on the permafrost, at a rate that is double the previous estimates. As the permafrost thaws, who knows what else will be revealed? All kinds of long frozen artifacts have been emerging from the ground recently, from well-preserved humans to a 30,000-year-old baby horse. One real but still unquantifiable risk: long frozen bacteria and viruses like anthrax and smallpox could emerge, triggering an epidemic that plays out like a climate change-driven remake of the Andromeda strain. Plenty of people see the melting Arctic as a boon, of course. In the next few days, the first container ship will sail through a new shipping route in the Arctic, potentially shortening travel times from Asia to Europe. In Greenland, new mining operations, mostly for rare metals, are poised to open as the ice sheets retreat. For the Russians, the Arctic is a new military frontier, a place for Vladimir Putin to show Northern Europeans who's boss. And of course, nobody is doing more than President Trump to ensure a blue Arctic in the very near future. In recent months, the Trump administration has successfully pushed Congress to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for drilling, and proposed both rolling back vehicle emission standards and rewriting the Clean Power Plan to loosen limits on carbon pollution from power plants. If there is any clearer way of saying I could give a shit about the Arctic or any other fragile ecosystem, I can't think of it. Can the Arctic be saved? In theory, various geoengineering strategies might eventually be deployed to slow the melt, but for 10,000 different reasons, which you can read about here, it's a dangerous idea. A far better solution would be an all-out assault on carbon emissions, a goal which, urgent as it may be, the world has made zero progress toward in the last 3 decades. Well, thank you for being a little closer to the truth on that. Save the Arctic, however, is not a rallying cry that's going to motivate many Americans. Excuse me. The Arctic is too distant, too far away, and too alien. That doesn't matter. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Think of the Arctic as our early warning system. A big screaming alarm that is alerting us to the fact that the planet we live on tomorrow is nothing like the planet we lived on yesterday. And we better get ready. As the Arctic heats up, it raises sea levels in Miami and Bangladesh and every other coastal city in the world, and it increases the odds of wildfires in California and the West. In a sense, the massive changes that are taking place in the Arctic are remaking the weather in America and Northern Europe, with profound implications for everyone who lives there, whether they know it or not. And they are a reminder of one of the great truths about climate change. and one that is hardest to grasp. In our rapidly changing world, no place is too distant or too far away to matter. Like it or not, we are all in this together. When ice melts in the Arctic, the West burns. I don't know if that's the actual end of the article, but that is all I'm going to read. And moving on to seeing what I can get in tonight. Moving on to this from Motherboard. I grabbed this off of Facebook. Jennifer Hines posted this. Scientists warn the UN of capitalism's imminent demise. Climate change-fueled switch away from fossil fuels means the worldwide economy will fundamentally need to change. You don't say. Capitalism as we know it is over, so suggests a new report commissioned by a group of scientists appointed the UN Secretary General. The main reason, we're transitioning rapidly to a radically different global economy due to our increasingly unsustainable exploitation of the planet's environmental resources. Yes, so to sum up, I'm going to read the rest of this, but to sum up, capitalism is going to change whether we change it ourselves or it changes itself for us. So best to be prepared. Climate change and species extinctions are accelerating even as the societies are experiencing rising inequality, unemployment, slow economic growth, rising debt levels, and impotent governments. Contrary to the way policymakers usually think about these problems, the new report says that these are not really separate crises at all. Rather, these crises are part of the same fundamental transition to a new era characterized by inefficient fossil fuel production and the escalating costs of climate change. Conventional capitalist economic thinking can no longer explain, predict, or solve the workings of the global economy in this new age, the paper says. Energy shift. Those are the stark implications of a new scientific background paper prepared by a team of Finnish biophysicists. The team from the BIOS research unit in Finland were asked to provide research that would feed into the drafting of the UN Global Sustainable Development Report, which will be released in 2019. For the first time in human history, the paper says, capitalist economies are shifting to energy sources that are less energy efficient. This applies to all forms of energy, producing usable energy, exergy, to keep powering both basic and non-basic human activities. Non-human basic activities. An industrial civilization will require more, not less, effort. Hold on, what you talking about? Economies have used up the capacity of planetary ecosystems to handle the waste generated by energy and material use. The amount of energy we can extract compared to the energy we are using to extract it is decreasing across the spectrum. Unconventional oils, nuclear, and renewables return less energy in generation than conventional oils, whose production has peaked. Societies need to abandon fossil fuels because of their impact on the climate, the paper states. The shift to renewables might help solve the climate challenge, but for the foreseeable future will not generate the same levels of energy as cheap conventional oil. In the meantime, our hunger for energy is driving what the paper refers to as sink costs. The greater our energy and material use, the more waste we generate, and so the greater the environmental costs. Though they can be ignored for a while, eventually those environmental costs translate directly into economic costs as it becomes more difficult to ignore their impacts on our societies. Do you recall the computer output in 1973 of, what was the name of the computer? I forget. Anyways, you see the graphs, right? This going down, this going up, and then, humanity. And the biggest sink cost, of course, is climate change. Sink costs are also rising. Economies have used up the capacity of planetary ecosystems to handle the waste generated by energy and material use. Climate change is the most pronounced sink cost, the paper states. The paper's lead author, Dr. Paavo Jarvansivu, is a biophysical economist, an emerging type of economist exploring the role of energy and materials in fueling economic activity. The BIOS paper suggests that much of the political and economic volatility we have seen in recent years has a root cause in ecological crisis. As the ecological and economic costs of industrial overconsumption continue to rise, the constant economic growth we have become accustomed to is now in jeopardy. That, in turn, has exerted massive strain on our politics. But the underlying issues are still unacknowledged and unrecognized by most policymakers, right? We live in an era of turmoil and profound change in the energetic and material underpinnings of the economies. The era of cheap energy is coming to an end, the paper says. Conventional economic models, the Finnish scientist notes, almost completely disregard the energetic and material dimensions of the economy. More expensive energy doesn't necessarily lead to economic collapse. Jarvansivu told me, of course, people won't have the same consumption opportunities. There's not enough cheap energy available for that, but they are not automatically led to unemployment and misery either. The scientists refer to the pioneering work of systems ecologist Professor Charles Hall of the State University of New York with economist Professor Kent Klitgaard from Wells College. Earlier this year, Hall and Klitgaard released an updated edition of their seminal book, Energy and the Wealth of Nations, an Introduction to Biophysical Economics. Hall and Klitgaard are highly critical of mainstream capitalist economic theory, which they say has become divorced from some of the most fundamental principles of science. They refer to the concept of energy return on investment, EROI, as a key indicator of the shift into a new age of difficult energy. EROI is a simple ratio that measures how much energy we use to extract more energy. For the last century, all we had to do was pump more and more oil out of the ground. Since Hall and Klitgaard, decades ago, fossil fuels had very high EROI values. A little bit of energy allowed us to extract large amounts of oil, gas, and coal. But as I've previously reported for Motherboard, this is no longer the case. Now we're using more and more energy to extract smaller quantities of fossil fuels, which means higher production costs to produce what we need to keep the economy rolling. The stuff is still there in the ground, billions of barrels worth to be sure, easily enough to fry the climate several times over. But it's harder and more expensive to get out, and the environmental costs of doing so are rising dramatically, as we've caught a glimpse of this with this summer's global heat wave. These costs are not recognized by capitalist markets. They literally cannot be seen by prevailing economic models. We face a form of capitalism that has hardened its focus to short-term profit maximization with little or no apparent interest in social good. Earlier in August, billionaire investor Jeremy Grantham, who has a track record of consistently calling financial bubbles, released an update to his April 2013 analysis, The Race of Our Lives. The new paper, The Race of Our Lives Revisited, provides, I find that slightly humorous, provides a bruising indictment of contemporary capitalism's complicity in the ecological crisis. Grantham's verdict is that capitalism and mainstream economics simply cannot deal with these problems, namely the systematic depletion of planetary ecosystems and environmental resources. The replacement cost of the copper, phosphate, oil, and soil, and so on that we use is not even considered. If it were, it's likely that the last 10 or 20 years for the developed world anyways has seen no true profit at all, no increase in income, but the reverse, he wrote. Efforts to account for these so-called externalities by calculating their actual costs have been well-meaning, but have had negligible impact on the actual operation of capitalist markets. In short, according to Grantham, we face a form of capitalism that has hardened its focus to short-term profit maximization with little or no apparent interest in social good. Yet for all his prescience and critical insights, Grantham misses the most fundamental factor in the great unraveling in which we now find ourselves. The transition to a low EROI future in which we simply cannot extract the same levels of energy and material surplus that we did decades ago. Many experts believe we're moving past capitalism, but they disagree on what the ultimate outcome will be. In his book, Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future, British economics journalist Paul Mason theorizes that information technology is paving the way for the emancipation of labor by reducing the cost of knowledge production and potentially other kinds of production that will be transformed by AI, blockchain, and so on to zero. Thus, he says, will emerge a utopian post-capitalist age of mass abundance beyond the price system and rules of capitalism. It sounds peachy, but Mason completely ignores the colossal, exponentially increasing physical infrastructure for the Internet of Things. This digital uprising is projected to consume ever more vast quantities of energy, as much as 1/5 of global electricity by 2025, producing 14% of global carbon emissions by 2040. Toward a new economic operating system. Most observers then have no idea of the biophysical realities pointed out in the background paper commissioned by the UN Secretary General's IGS, that the driving force of the transition to post-capitalism is the decline of what made endless growth capitalism possible in the first place, abundant, cheap energy. The UN's Global Sustainable Development Report is being drafted by an independent group of scientists appointed by the UN Secretary General. The IGS is supported by a range of UN agencies, including the UN Secretariat, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the UN Environment Program, the UN Development Program, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and the World Bank. The paper, co-authored by Dr. Javan Sivu, with the rest of the BIOS team, was commissioned by the UN's IGS specifically to feed into the chapter on transformation, the economy. Invited background documents are used as the basis of the GSDR, but what ends up in the final report will not be known until the final report is released next year. No widely applicable economic models have been developed specifically for the upcoming era. Nope. Not at all. Overall, the paper claims that we have moved into a new, unpredictable, and unprecedented space in which the conventional economic toolbox has no answers. As slow economic growth simmers along, central banks have resorted to negative interest rates and buying up huge quantities of public debt to keep our economies rolling. But what happens after these measures are exhausted? Governments and bankers are running out of options. It can be safely said that no widely applicable economic models have been developed specifically for the upcoming era, write the Finnish scientists. Having identified the gap, they lay out the opportunities for transition. In this low EROI future, we simply have to accept the hard fact that we will not be able to sustain current levels of economic growth. Meeting current or growing levels of energy need in the next few decades with low carbon solutions will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, the paper finds. The economic transition must involve efforts to lower total energy use. Key areas to achieve this include transport, food, and construction. City planning needs to adapt to the promotion of walking and biking, a shift toward public transport, as well as the electrification of transport. Homes and workplaces will become more connected and localized. Meanwhile, international freight transport and aviation cannot continue to grow at current rates. And they must decline. That's my addition. As with transport, the global food system will need to be overhauled. Climate change and oil-intensive agriculture have unearthed the dangers of countries becoming dependent on food imports from a few main production areas. A shift toward food self-sufficiency across poorer and richer countries will be essential, and ultimately dairy and meat should make way for a largely plant-based diets. The construction industry's focus on energy-intensive manufacturing, dominated by concrete and steel, should be replaced by alternative materials. The BIOS paper recommends a return to the use of long-lasting wood buildings, which can help store carbon, but other options such as biochar might be effective too. The capitalist markets will not be capable of facilitating the required changes. Governments will need to step up, and institutions will need to actively shape markets to fit the goals of human survival. Right now, the prospects for this look slim, but the new paper argues that either way, change is coming. Right, exactly. Change or be changed. Whether or not the system that emerges still comprises a form of capitalism is ultimately a semantic question. It depends on how you define capitalism. Capitalism in that situation is not like ours now, said Jarvan Sivu. Economic activity is driven by meaning, maintaining equal possibilities for the good life while lowering emissions dramatically rather than profit. And the meaning is politically, collectively constructed. Well, I think this is the best conceivable case in terms of modern state and market institutions. It can't happen without considerable reframing of economic political thinking, however. Subtext of that article is, we are in big trouble. It's not that it's not just that nobody's thought about it or come up with a new model. It's like they just don't want to think about it. I don't hear really like grand proposals, because everybody's like, we must keep this machine chugging. It's not just Trump and his band of boneheads. It's everybody. It's the whole system. It's the whole political system. Nobody's really rethinking, even progressives, even the Green Party. I mean, maybe the Green Party at the most is it's the most radical as far as ideas, but even their ideas aren't really not that radical. We need some seriously, we need to disassemble and reassemble our system in very profound ways. I'm going to finish with this comment from Kent Deal, which I really liked. Walking away from our jobs is the only actual vote that matters. This is in response to yesterday's video. We have to vote with our bodies and labor. The biggest hurdle is making the transition to a new way of living. It is within our power to survive without the system that made for us. They made for us, a system bent on making people dependent on its existence. By participating, we are complicit in the damage that continues to mount. But we fail to make the effort required because we fear the loss of comfort, the loss of reliability and consistency in our daily lives. Those things are addictions, and we know that the push towards community and then civilization arose out of addiction. The rich are our dealers, and they hold power over all of us. Sugar, caffeine, alcohol, money, gas, tobacco, sex, drugs, and yes, the rock and roll too, all are devices of control, and when tightly controlled, are very efficient mechanisms of control. In the country, you see people that have retained some of that control. There are plenty of bootleggers where I am, for example. People have forgotten what freedom really is. As few know the liberty to live free of the controls of state. Folks, by me, even have a say in who is on the police force in the area. If they don't like how you're dispensing justice, they will make it clear that the officer has little time to leave before they burn their house down. It is not uncommon for neighborhoods to eject residents that are seen as threats by the same means. And so house fires are often a spectacle, pleasing to the crowd of onlookers. And no people who are physically harmed in the process. But the point I often try to make is that rural life is different, sometimes challenging, but the rewards are daily and valuable beyond words. And to make another point, I think I've mentioned before, but could use to be restated. The world we must accept and transition to rapidly is that world. Imposing restrictions on urban dwellers will be commonplace in short order, or we are duly fucked, as so many like to think already. Those that resolve to stand their ground in cities will find their lives stripped away abruptly, often. While in rural settings, you have all that your hands can produce. And if you are a farmer, well, the world will be relying on you. Urban areas would cease to exist without local food production, which many people are saying is inevitable. So I am very confident that no matter what road we find ourselves on, getting rural is in store for many people. It has been going on now for a spell, but nothing like the exodus to come. Being a successful farmer takes time, but I have a friend that did it in 2 years of practical farming. It seems that lots of rich folks are buying up land and they hire people to farm their land. None of the owners make any money, as they are ill-prepared for running a farm. They do little to no work themselves, then slip into an afternoon of engaging in their addictions. For young folk, that there are people making $100,000 off of an acre of land. Some even do this in cities themselves, renting available backyards. This has created a great opportunity for novice farmers to learn on the job. Only 4 years in, one has been hired to oversee a farm to restaurant operation in Toronto. He was a successful pastry chef before he switched to farming. There is a growing demand that is a catapult for anyone that can handle the workload. Jump in. If you have any inspiration to explore a rural lifestyle, we can be heroes. The hardest part is climbing that first hill. Awesome comment from Kent Deal. Thank you. Indeed, this is the way of the future. This is the way forward, and this will be the way, whether you choose it or not. It will be chosen for you, and that is roughly the theme of this video. And that's pretty much all I have to say. So I'm gonna say once again to if you've been kicked off the channel or you got unsubscribed, just resubscribe. I'm going to be actually camping for the next 3 days, so I don't think I'll be uploading any videos. I doubt I will have a chance to. I'm probably going to take some footage while I'm gone, because I'm going to be up in the mountains, and I'm going to kind of try and document what the tree situation looks like in California. In Los Angeles, it is terrible. It's getting worse by the day. Anybody who's familiar with the Griffith Park or Chavez Ravine near Dodger Stadium, that area, the hills up there look really bad. The trees are all dead, and they look like they've been burned from a fire, but they are not burned from a fire. They're just dead and dying trees from heat, basically, and drought and the changing climate. They are not recovering, and it will get worse. And eventually we will move into a state where there'll be more dead trees than live ones, and then perhaps people will start to go, I wonder what's going on. I wonder if we should do something. But yeah, so anyways, hopefully I get some good footage, and we'll relay that to you when I get back. So thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.